On August 18, 2025, the Supreme Court delivered a decision that shook the world to its core, sending shockwaves through every corner of the nation and beyond. The anticipation had been building for weeks, with citizens, politicians, and global leaders all anxiously awaiting the outcome of a case that would define the future of American trade policy. In a landmark 6-3 ruling, the justices struck down the core of former President Trump's sweeping tariff authority, a move that many had speculated about but few truly expected to see. The ruling instantly upended years of established trade policy, sending financial markets into a tailspin. Stock tickers plummeted, traders scrambled for answers, and newsrooms across the country broke into urgent coverage as the implications became clear. For a nation already on edge from economic uncertainty and political division, it was a seismic shift, one that would ripple outward from the marble halls of Washington to the checkout lines of everyday Americans, touching every household and business. Trump's America First agenda had relied heavily on unilateral tariffs, using them as both shield and sword to protect U.S. industries and pressure foreign nations into new deals. Factories, ports, and workers across the country had felt the impact, for better or worse. But now, the court declared this strategy unconstitutional, stripping the president of broad tariff powers and fundamentally altering the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. International leaders, many of whom had long been critical of U.S. tariffs, watched with cautious optimism as the news flashed across their screens. The world wondered if a new era of global trade cooperation might be dawning. Wall Street reeled, companies and farmers questioned their futures, and consumers everywhere wondered if relief from rising prices was finally on the horizon. The uncertainty was palpable, and the stakes could not have been higher. The decision forced Congress to reclaim its long-neglected authority over trade, ending an era of executive dominance and setting the stage for fierce new debates over America's economic future. A new chapter in American trade policy and political conflict had begun, with the entire nation watching, waiting, and wondering what would come next. To truly grasp the Supreme Court's impact on the nation, we must first understand the context that set the stage for their involvement. This means revisiting Trump's America First trade doctrine, a policy that reshaped the country's economic landscape and global relationships. Trump argued that decades of globalism had failed American workers, claiming that unfair trade deals and cheap imports were hollowing out U.S. industry. Tariffs, he insisted, were the solution, making foreign goods more expensive to give American manufacturers a fighting chance. He imposed sweeping tariffs on steel, aluminum, and especially Chinese imports, igniting a global trade war that sent shockwaves through international markets and diplomatic circles. Supporters saw him as a bold champion for American jobs, finally willing to disrupt the status quo and take risks for long-term national gain, even if it meant short-term pain. Critics, including many economists and business leaders, warned that tariffs would backfire, hurting U.S. consumers and companies most by raising prices, squeezing profits, and making everyday goods less affordable. Farmers in particular suffered as countries like China retaliated with their own tariffs, devastating rural economies and leaving crops unsold, equipment idle, and communities struggling to survive. The nation became deeply divided. Some saw tariffs as vital for national security and economic fairness, while others viewed them as a dangerous path to isolation, higher costs, and lost global influence. Free trade advocates pointed to rising inflation, broken supply chains, and damaged alliances with key partners, arguing that the costs far outweighed the benefits. The America First policy, they argued, was slowly turning into America alone, isolated on the world stage with fewer friends and more economic uncertainty. Now, the Supreme Court's ruling would force a national reckoning with these deep divisions, setting the course for America's future in a turbulent world. The legal battle was about more than economics. It was about the Constitution. Who controls trade? The Constitution gives Congress that power, but over decades, Congress delegated much of it to the president. Trump used these broad laws, especially Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, to justify sweeping tariffs, even on allies. Critics said this was an abuse, letting the president bypass Congress under the guise of national security. Businesses sued, arguing the president had overstepped and violated the separation of powers. Their case, Congress's delegation was so broad, it was unconstitutional. The government countered that Congress had knowingly granted this authority, and presidents needed flexibility in a fast-changing world. The Supreme Court now had to decide, where does executive power end and legislative authority begin? The stakes for American governance and global trade were enormous. Chief Justice Roberts' majority opinion didn't strike down trade laws, but reined in their interpretation. The court invoked the non-delegation doctrine. Congress can't hand over its core powers without clear limits. The justices ruled that giving the president broad tariff authority for vague national security reasons was unconstitutional. Congress must be specific. No more blank checks for the executive. The dissent warned this would tie the president's hands in crises, but the majority insisted on checks and balances. The ruling ended the era of the tariff-in-chief, putting trade policy back in Congress's hands. Future tariffs would require public debate and new legislation. The message, the power to tax imports, belongs to Congress, not the president. The reaction was swift and fierce. Trump, from Mar-a-Lago, called the ruling a betrayal and railed against the justices, rallying his base. Democrats largely celebrated the decision as a check on executive overreach, while some progressives worried it might limit future protections for labor and the environment. Republicans split. Free traders cheered. Trump loyalists vowed to restore presidential power. Business groups, especially those relying on global supply chains, welcomed the ruling and hoped for tariff relief. Steel and aluminum producers, once protected, warned of job losses. Internationally, leaders praised the move as a step toward stability and cooperation. The world saw a chance for a return to predictable, rules-based trade. The economic ripples were immediate. Importers anticipated lower costs as tariffs vanished, promising relief for consumers on everything from electronics to wine. For families battling inflation, falling prices offered hope. U.S. manufacturers using imported materials cheered, but domestic producers braced for tougher competition and possible layoffs. Farmers, battered by retaliatory tariffs, saw new opportunities as export markets reopened. The job market faced churn. Some sectors would shrink, others would grow. Diplomats scrambled to renegotiate trade deals, hoping for reciprocal tariff cuts from other nations. The global trade chessboard was reset, with every country reconsidering its next move. The transition would be painful for some, but the promise of renewed trade and lower prices was real. The Supreme Court's decision had changed the rules overnight. The court's decision rewired Washington's power structure. Congress could no longer dodge responsibility for trade. It was now front and center. This exposed deep rifts in both parties. Republicans split between free traders drafting new legislation and Trump loyalists demanding protectionism. Democrats welcomed the check on presidential power, but disagreed on how to balance global engagement with worker protections. The result: gridlock and a power vacuum with no clear leader on trade. Emergency hearings began with business, labor, and economists all weighing in. The fight was no longer about one president's vision, but the future direction of the U.S. economy. Congress had the reins, but steering through the storm would be a challenge. The era of executive-driven trade was over. Now the messy work of democracy began. The Supreme Court's landmark ruling brought an end to the era of unilateral trade wars, signaling a dramatic shift in how America approaches global commerce and economic disputes. This decision forced the United States into a new era, one defined by negotiation, compromise, and a renewed focus on diplomacy with both allies and rivals. Now, Congress faces the daunting challenge of crafting a coherent, bipartisan trade strategy. In a nation deeply divided along political lines, finding common ground is no easy task. Rebuilding trust with long-standing allies is essential, and working through global institutions like the World Trade Organization will be more crucial than ever to ensure fair and stable trade relationships. New trade agreements must rise to meet modern challenges, addressing not only digital commerce, but also labor rights, environmental protection, and the rapid pace of technological change. Protectionist voices remain strong, warning against deals that could hurt American workers or threaten local industries, fueling debates in communities across the country. Meanwhile, other nations are moving forward, forging their own trade blocs and partnerships, strengthening their positions in the global market, and risking the isolation of the United States if Congress cannot act decisively and quickly. The challenge ahead is to find a middle ground, one that ensures the benefits of trade are shared broadly, supporting both businesses and workers. Tariffs may still play a role in protecting key industries, but they must be used as targeted tools, not as sweeping policy. Investing in American workers, retraining and education, and helping industries adapt to global realities will be key to maintaining America's economic leadership. Ultimately, the future of U.S. trade depends on building bridges, not walls, fostering cooperation, innovation, and prosperity for all. This Supreme Court decision will touch your life. As tariffs fade, expect lower prices on everyday goods, though not overnight. If you work in a protected industry, competition may increase. If you rely on exports, new markets could open. With Congress now in charge, your voice matters more. Contacting your representatives can shape trade policy. The process is more democratic, but also demands greater public engagement. America faces a choice: protect industries at all costs, or embrace global engagement. The court didn't pick a side. It handed the decision back to the people and their lawmakers. As this new era unfolds, staying informed and involved is more important than ever. The rules of trade have changed, and so will the world you live in.